Chapter 1. Suffering is inevitable. When you raise children, you hope to shield them from suffering. You do everything in your power to keep painful experiences at bay. I remember when my boys were little. Nathan was 4 and Gabe was 6, and we visited my mom and dad in Central Florida. We were inside the house while the boys played outside with one of the neighborhood kids. When we called them in for dinner, Gabe came running and said, "The boy we were playing with showed me a bad picture." My wife, Kim, ran outside immediately and found that this little 7-year-old boy had a stash of incredibly explicit pornography that he'd probably stolen from his dad. I wept myself to sleep that night. They're 6 and 4, and they've already seen this stuff, I thought. It may seem like a minor incident, but this was the first time that the nastiness and darkness of this world crowded into their innocent, naive world. I couldn't stop thinking about how it could come back to haunt them, that this could be the beginning of a lifelong addiction that could crush them and ruin their marriages. It was devastating to me, and the first time as a parent that I was beside myself. It was merely the tip of the iceberg, but that didn't make it any less painful. I was confronted with the truth that my boys were no more immune to the tragic realities of the world than I was. Benjamin Franklin memorably captured the inevitability of pain in this life when he wrote, "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes." And while his tone may not necessarily reflect the gravity of the sentiment, he was right. From the death of a loved one, to hurricanes and tsunamis, to the loss of a job, to chronic back pain or inexplicable depression, suffering is everywhere. When the satirical newspaper The Onion published the mock headline, "Average time spent being happy drops to 13 seconds per day," it confirmed, in a laugh or you'll cry way, what I've learned from 15 years in ministry. People suffer more deeply and more frequently than they admit, even those who appear to be doing well. In other words, if you're not suffering in some way right now, just wait. Things are not as they should be. Physical pain and sickness are perhaps the most overt forms of suffering. This ranges from a kindergartner's stubbed toe to a teenager's stress-induced migraines to stomach cancer in old age. It all hurts, and as the multi-billion-dollar medical technology and pharmaceutical industries can attest, we do everything in our power to stave off the decay. Job himself suffered from excruciating boils, or, in more modern language, the sores that form around infected hair follicles. If you know someone who's ever dealt with this affliction, you know that it can be unbearably painful. A friend of mine described his ordeal with a boil on his shoulder as the sensation of a knife being continually jabbed into his back. Imagine that kind of pain across your entire body, and you might have a glimpse into what Job would have suffered. I hope that most of us have not faced the kind of pain and discomfort that Job did, although there are likely female readers who have experienced the intense pain of childbirth and will claim otherwise. But the issue here is not so much the comparative depth of suffering, but simply the fact that we suffer. No one is exempt from the dust to dust, ashes to ashes verdict handed down in the Garden of Eden. Relational suffering is just as universal and severe, though perhaps a bit more elusive. Who hasn't felt misunderstood or taken advantage of? Who hasn't been insulted or cheated or rejected? As life-giving as our relationships with other people can be, they can also be sources of resentment and regret. This form of suffering applies to men and women, children and parents, colleagues at work, and members of your church. The issues involved may be trivial, but the feelings aren't. When a parent misses the game he promised he'd move heaven and earth to attend, it hurts. Getting dumped when you're 16 years old is extraordinarily painful. So is divorce when you're 45. Equally painful are the passive-aggressive comments from a coworker at the office or from the mothers at the playground. And then there's endless stream of feedback about how you're filing your TPS reports at work, office space. This list goes on. Emotional pain is the risk we run when we relate to another person. Job suffered immensely in this regard. In the midst of all that he had gone through, including loss of home, livelihood, children, and finally, his health, his wife chimed in. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Job was already disoriented and alone in his suffering, and the person he loved most told him to just give up, turn his back on God, and die. If there's anyone in Job's life that should have been there to comfort him in his time of blinding agony, it was his wife. The feeling of abandonment must have been terrible. As if that weren't enough, we then read a 30-odd chapter conversation between Job and his friends, in which the friends pick apart every aspect of Job's life in a, frankly, rather creepy kind of spiritual surveillance, looking for some hidden sin they can pin the suffering on. The misguided assumption they are working with, of course, is that nobody suffers these kinds of reversals unless he or she did something to deserve it. We'll return to their ruthless moralizing later. For now, suffice it to say that Job's friends were great counselors, until they opened their mouths. These relational betrayals give a whole new meaning to the phrase, kicking a man when he's down. This is not to suggest that suffering can ever be neatly organized or clinically categorized. The most tragic events in our lives, such as the sudden death of a loved one, have both physical and emotional components, not to mention spiritual ones. And to the sufferer, the precise makeup is irrelevant. Loss is loss, and it stings, pure and simple. Nicholas Walterstorff is a Christian who taught philosophical theology for many years at Yale. He and his wife have 6 children, but he lost an adult son. His son Eric, who was 25 at the time, died in a mountain climbing accident. Walterstorff chronicled the grief he experienced through his loss in a journal. This is a man who had devoted his life to the understanding, meaning, and reality of life's mysteries, and he suddenly, strikingly, lost a son. In a single moment, all his intellectual categories for making sense of the existence of evil and pain were demolished. He published his journal years later as a book titled Lament for a Son. The book opens with his recollection of the moment the dreaded phone call came. The call came at 3:30 on that Sunday afternoon, a bright sunny day. We had just sent his younger brother off to the plane to be with him for the summer. Mr. Walterstorff? Yes. Is this Eric's father? Yes. Mr. Walterstorff, I must give you some bad news. Yes. Eric has been climbing in the mountains and has had an accident. Yes. Eric has had a serious accident. Yes. Mr. Walterstorff, I must tell you, Eric is dead. Mr. Walterstorff, are you there? You must come at once. Mr. Walterstorff, Eric is dead. For 3 seconds, I felt the peace of resignation. Arms extended, limp son in hand, peacefully offering him to someone. Someone. Then the pain. Cold, burning pain. Walterstorff's harrowing account explodes the tempting notion that if we only grasped God's will more clearly, if we only knew something we don't know now, the wound would hurt less. But the gospel is not ultimately a defense from pain and suffering. Rather, it is the message of God's rescue through pain. In fact, it allows us to drop our defenses, to escape not from pain, but from the prison of how and why, to the freedom of who. We are not responsible for finding the right formula to combat or unlock our suffering. The good news of the gospel does not consist of theological assertions of some elaborate religious how-to manual. The good news is Jesus himself, the man of sorrows, the crucified God who meets us in our grief. Indeed, information, even information about Jesus, is relatively useless when it comes to the aching soul. Only the Holy Spirit can comfort a person in the depths of grief. Neil Young claims that only love can break your heart, but only God can heal it. Does this mean that the Bible is of no help when it comes to suffering? Of course not. The counterintuitive message of the cross is a message of immense hope and comfort to those who are perishing. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, after all, but the sick.